Brace yourself. A human warship is incoming. They entered human space. Only ashes remained. Part 1. The alarm did not sound like alarms were supposed to sound. It was low and slow, almost gentle, like a bell rung by someone who did not want to wake the whole house. But everyone on the station of Velkar Reach knew what that soft, slow tone meant. It meant a ship had crossed the outer marker, the invisible line drawn in empty space that separated the known trade lanes from the places no one liked to talk about. Commander Issa Rolt stood on the bridge of the watch station, her 4 eyes blinking in different rhythms as she read the data scrolling across the panel in front of her. She was Dravith, a species with gray-blue skin and long fingers built for delicate work, and she had served on this border post for 11 years. In all that time, the soft alarm had rung only twice. Both times it had been nothing, a drifting mining freighter, a comet with a strange metal core. She hoped, quietly, that this would be the same. "Report," she said, and her voice did not shake, though something cold moved through her chest. The young officer at the sensor station, a Koran named Bassett, did not answer right away. He kept staring at his screen as if the numbers might change if he looked at them long enough. "Bassett," she said again. "Ma'am," he said, "it's a single ship, large, very large. It came out of nowhere, no drive signature before it appeared, like it was already moving at speed when our sensors caught it. Define large. Bigger than anything in our registry, bigger than a Dominion carrier, maybe 3 kilometers, bow to stern." The bridge went quiet. Even the soft hum of the station's air recyclers seemed to grow louder in the silence. "IFF signal?" Issa asked. "Nothing recognized, but—" Bassett swallowed. "The hull markings match an old file. A very old file. Restricted." Issa felt her stomach tighten. She walked to his station and looked at the screen herself. There, next to the shape of the incoming ship, was a small flashing tag. Human, archive designation, do not engage without command authorization. She had seen files like this only once before, back when she was a young cadet at the War College. They showed her the ashes. They showed her the pictures of empty planets and silent fleets. And they told her a story that she had never fully believed, because it seemed too much like something out of a nightmare made to frighten children. Human. The word alone was enough to make the hair on her arms stand up, even though she had no hair. "Get me a channel to Fleet Command," she said. "Now. And put the base on full alert. Quietly. I don't want panic. I want readiness." Bassett's hands moved fast over his console, but they were shaking. Far away, on the capital world of Sanok Prime, in a tower that rose taller than any mountain the planet had ever grown naturally, the news reached the desk of Grand Marshal Dorun Kesh within minutes. He was an old Dravith, older than Issa by 2 full centuries, and he had seen many wars. He had fought pirates. He had fought rogue AI swarms. He had once negotiated peace with an entire hive species that communicated only through smell. But when the message came across his desk, his 4 eyes all went still at once, which for a Dravith was the equivalent of a human's blood running cold. "Confirm," he said to the aide standing before him. "Confirm the designation." "Confirmed, sir. Archive tag human. Matches the pattern from the old war records. Hull configuration, size, and drive signature align with the ship classes recovered from the ash line." Dorun sat back in his chair. For a long moment he said nothing. The aide, a young Vren with mottled green skin, shifted uncomfortably, unsure whether to speak again. "Sir," the aide finally said, "should I wake the council?" "Wake them," Dorun said. "Wake all of them. And pull every file we have, every survivor account, every recording. I want the full record of the Ash War in front of me within the hour." The aide left quickly. Dorun remained in his chair, staring at the star map on the wall, at the small red border that marked the edge of what the old records called human space. No one crossed that line. No one had crossed it in 50 years. It was written into treaties that no living being had ever seen enforced, because it had never needed to be enforced. Everyone simply knew. You did not go there. And now it seemed, something from there had come out. To understand why an entire alliance of starfaring species felt its knees go weak at a single incoming ship, one had to understand what happened 50 years before. in the time that the history books of 100 worlds called the Ash War. Back then, the galaxy was ruled, or believed itself to be ruled, by a great alliance called the Concord of Stars. The Concord was made of many species: the Dravath, careful and clever; the Koran, quick and brave; the Vren, patient and wise; and dozens of others, all bound together under one banner, one fleet, one law. The Concord had expanded across 1,000 systems, meeting new species as it went, absorbing some, trading with others, and occasionally fighting the ones who refused to bend. In those days, scouts of the Concord found a strange, quiet system on the far edge of the galactic disk. The system held a single inhabited world, blue and green, wrapped in white clouds. Their scans showed radio signals, old, chaotic signals, some of them containing images and voices. The scouts listened for a long time. What they heard confused them: music, arguments, laughter, crying, songs about love and about war, stories about monsters and heroes. It was a species that seemed, from a distance, disorganized, loud, emotional, weak. The Concord had encountered species like this before, species too caught up in their own small conflicts to notice the wider galaxy, too divided to build a real fleet, too soft to survive real war. Many such species had been folded gently into the Concord, given technology, given peace, given a place in the great order of things, as long as they submitted to Concord law. The council of that time voted, almost without debate, to send a diplomatic fleet to make first contact and begin the process of bringing this new species, calling themselves humans, into the fold. It was meant to be a simple mission. A show of strength, yes, because that was tradition. You always brought warships to first contact, so the new species understood who held the power. But it was not meant to be a war. No one expected a war. The fleet, 70 ships strong, crossed into the system that humans called Sol. They found the blue and green world exactly where the scans said it would be. But something was wrong immediately. There was no response. No hail, no welcome, no panic even, just silence. The fleet commander at the time, a Koran named Vashtu Delin, ordered a probe sent down toward the planet's largest continent, where the radio signals had been strongest. The probe found ruins. Not new ruins. Not ruins from a war that had just happened. Old ruins, weathered by wind and rain. Cities half swallowed by forest and grass. Towers broken and rusted. Roads cracked and empty. Whatever civilization had built these cities, it seemed to have died out long ago, leaving only broadcasts, still bouncing endlessly off the ionosphere, echoes of voices from people long gone. Vashtu's fleet stayed in orbit for 3 days, scanning, searching, trying to understand what had happened to this species. They found no bodies, no mass graves, no signs of plague or nuclear fire, just empty cities and endless, echoing silence. It was the perfect setup for a Concord operation, an empty world, valuable and untouched, ready to be claimed. Vashtu sent word back to the council. The system was open, resources were plentiful, and there did not appear to be any surviving population to negotiate with. He requested permission to begin the formal claiming process. But he was wrong, and that mistake would echo through the galaxy for 50 years. The humans were not dead. They were not extinct. They had left their old world of Earth generations before, driven out by wars that had nearly destroyed them, and they had scattered across dozens of systems on their edge of the galaxy, quiet and hidden, building new homes, new fleets, new lives, while old Earth stood empty as a monument to what they had almost lost themselves to. And they had been watching the edge of Concord space for a long time, ever since their listening posts first caught the faint signals of Concord scout ships decades before. They had studied, they had prepared, they had built. When Vashtu's fleet entered the system that had once been humanity's home, alarms rang across a dozen human colonies at once. It was treated, correctly, as an invasion. Dorun Kesh had read this part of the record more times than he could count, but every time, it still filled him with a strange, heavy dread. He sat now in the council chamber, surrounded by representatives from a dozen species, all of them watching the old recordings play on the great screen at the front of the room. The recordings were grainy, damaged by time, but the shapes on the screen were unmistakable. Human ships, Sleek, dark, fast. Nothing like the boxy, heavy cruisers the Concorde favored. These ships moved like predators, cutting through space in patterns that Concorde tacticians of the time had called reckless, until they realized the pattern was not reckless at all, but simply unfamiliar. The first battle happened at the edge of the Sol system, when a wing of unmarked human ships intercepted a Concorde scout squadron that had been sent ahead of the main fleet. The scout squadron, 5 ships strong, sent one desperate message back before the channel went silent forever. They came from nowhere. They didn't ask. They didn't warn us. The message ended there. Vashtu Delany, believing this to be an isolated raid by pirates or rogue elements, ordered his main fleet forward to secure the system and punish whoever had attacked his scouts. It was, in hindsight, the second mistake, and it was much larger than the first. What followed was not recorded in full detail by any Concorde source, because very few Concorde ships survived to send reports. What was known came from fragments, distress calls, damaged flight recorders recovered decades later, and eventually, much later, testimony from the few Concorde officers who survived and were released by human forces after the war ended. The human fleet that met Vashtu's 70 ships did not look large. Survivors described only a dozen or so vessels, smaller in number than the Concorde fleet, but the humans did not fight the way the Concorde expected. They did not form up in neat lines. They did not send the traditional pre-battle transmission demanding surrender. They attacked in waves, using tactics that seemed almost savage in their creativity. Feints, decoys, ships that appeared to be crippled luring pursuers into traps, weapons that detonated not on contact but exactly when they calculated the most damage could be done. Within 6 hours, 40 of Vashtu's 70 ships were gone. Not damaged, gone, vaporized, or drifting as silent wreckage. The remaining 30 tried to retreat. The humans did not let them. It was during the retreat that the Concorde fleet first heard a human voice over an open channel, translated roughly by the Concorde's own systems from a captured signal. The words, preserved in the official Concorde archive despite everyone's wish to forget them, were simple. You crossed into our home uninvited, with warships, and you called it a greeting. We do not forgive that kind of mistake twice. Leave, if you can. Remember this, if you live. Only 9 ships of Vashtu's original 70 made it back across the border into Concorde territory. Vashtu himself was not among them. His flagship, the pride of the Concorde's western fleet, was the first to fall, torn apart in the opening minutes of the battle, by a weapon Concorde scientists would spend decades trying to understand, and never fully could. The 9 surviving ships brought back their sensor logs, their damaged systems, and the beginnings of a fear that would spread through the entire alliance like fire through dry grass. When the Council reviewed the logs, when they saw the tactics, the speed, the sheer controlled violence of what the humans had done in defense of an empty, half-forgotten homeworld, they understood, all at once, that they had made a terrible mistake in assuming this species was weak, simply because it had once seemed disorganized and emotional. The Council debated for weeks. Some wanted to send the full might of the Concorde fleet, thousands of ships, to crush this new threat before it could grow. Others, more cautious, pointed out that if a scattered defense force of a dozen ships could destroy 40 out of 70 Concorde warships in 6 hours, no one could say for certain what a full human battle fleet, gathered and prepared, might be capable of. In the end, fear won over pride. The Council did not send a second fleet. Instead, they sent a single unarmed diplomatic shuttle, broadcasting on every frequency they could find, offering full and immediate withdrawal from any territory the humans claimed, along with a formal apology and a request for a boundary treaty. It took nearly a year for a response to come. When it did, it was not from a grand human leader or emperor, as the Concorde diplomats had expected, but from a simple representative, calling herself only a speaker, who stated humanity's terms in short, plain words that were recorded and studied by Concorde scholars for years afterward. We do not want your worlds. We do not want your war. We want to be left alone, and we want everyone to understand something simple. We do not start fights, but we do not lose them either. Draw your border. Do not cross it. We will not cross yours. If either side breaks that promise, do not expect mercy. Because mercy was tried once, on an empty world called Earth, by people who are gone now because they trusted too easily. We are not those people anymore. The treaty was signed. The border was drawn, marked in every Concord star chart with a plain red line, and for 50 years, that line had held. No Concord ship crossed it. No human ship crossed it either, though a few had been sighted patrolling their own side, distant silhouettes glimpsed by long-range sensors and then gone. 50 years of silence. 50 years of an uneasy, careful peace, built on the ashes of one terrible mistake. And now, without warning, a single human warship had crossed the line, into Concord space. Back on Velkar Reach, Commander Issa Rolt watched the tactical display as the human ship continued its slow, steady approach. It was not accelerating toward any target. It was not powering weapons, at least none that her sensors could detect, though she reminded herself grimly that Concord sensors had failed to detect human weapons before, 50 years ago, until it was far too late. "Ma'am," Bassett said, his voice tight. "Fleet Command is answering. They want a direct feed to the Grand Marshal's office." "Patch it through," she said. The screen flickered, and the aged, weathered face of Dorfun Kesh appeared, his 4 eyes steady, despite what Issa could see was deep tension in the muscles of his neck and jaw. "Commander Rolt," he said, "report your situation, exactly as it stands. Do not speculate, just tell me what you see." "Sir, one ship, human designation confirmed by hull pattern match, approximately 3 kilometers in length, currently on a straight course, moving at moderate sublight speed. No active weapon signature, no communication sent. It crossed the border marker 11 minutes ago." "Any response to your hails?" "We haven't hailed it yet, sir. We wanted authorization first." Dorun was silent for a moment. Behind him, Issa could see the shapes of other council members moving in the background, agitated, some of them arguing quietly among themselves. "Hail it," Dorun said finally, peacefully. "Identify yourself, ask its intentions, and do not, under any circumstance, power up weapon systems unless it fires first. Do you understand me, Commander? Under any circumstance." "Understood, sir." The screen went dark, and Issa turned to Bassett. "Open a channel, all standard frequencies, and whatever old human frequencies we have on record." Bassett's hands trembled slightly as he worked, but his voice, when he spoke, was steady. "Channel open, ma'am." Issa took a breath, feeling the weight of 50 years of fear and history pressing down on her shoulders, and she spoke the words that would be remembered on Velkar Reach for the rest of its existence. "Unidentified vessel. This is Commander Issa Rolt, of the Concord border station Velkar Reach. You have crossed into Concord territory. Please identify yourself and state your intentions. We do not wish for conflict." The response did not come immediately. For nearly a full minute, there was only silence, the kind of silence that seemed to stretch every second into an hour. Issa watched the massive shape of the human ship on her screen, still moving steadily forward, still giving no sign that it had even noticed the hail. Then, at last, the comm panel lit up, and a voice came through. Calm, quiet, almost gentle, though there was something underneath it, something old and tired, and very, very serious. "Velkar Reach. This is Captain Elias Voss of the Concord." There was a small pause, as if the speaker had almost used the wrong word out of habit, and then corrected himself. "This is Captain Elias Voss, of the human vessel Ember's Rest. We are not here to start a war. We are here because we need to speak with your leaders. Something is coming, something bigger than the line drawn 50 years ago, and if we do not talk now, there may not be a later for either of us." Issa felt the blood drain from wherever a Dravith's blood normally pooled. Behind her, Bassett had gone completely still. "Copy, Ember's Rest," she managed to say. "Please hold position. We are relaying your message to Fleet Command immediately." "We'll hold," the human voice said, and then, after a pause, quieter, almost sad, "We remember what happened last time someone from your side crossed into ours without warning. We're not here to repeat that mistake. We just need you to listen." The channel went silent, but the human ship did not move, and did not power any weapons. It simply hung there in the dark, patient, enormous, and waiting. A single ship that carried within it the full weight of a species, that the entire Concord had learned, at terrible cost, never to underestimate again. On Senok Prime, in the tower that touched the sky, Dorun Kesh listened to the recording of the exchange 3 times before he spoke. When he finally did, his voice was quiet, but it carried through the whole chamber. "Prepare the Council flagship," he said. "I am going to meet this human captain myself, and someone find me every scrap of information we have on what could possibly be dangerous enough to make humanity break 50 years of silence to warn us about it." No one in the room argued. No one dared to. They had all grown up hearing about the ashes left behind after the Concord's first terrible mistake, and every one of them understood, in that moment, that whatever was coming next would decide far more than the fate of one border station. It would decide whether the fragile peace between 2 very different kinds of power could survive long enough to face whatever new danger now loomed somewhere out in the dark beyond even human space. Brace yourself. A human warship is incoming. They entered human space. Only ashes remained. Part 2. The Council flagship, a heavy cruiser named the Vigil of Senok, arrived at Velkar Reach 2 days after the human ship had first crossed the border. 2 days was not a long time by the standards of interstellar travel, but to Commander Yisa Rolt, standing on the small station's bridge and watching the massive human vessel Ember's Rest sit unmoving in the dark, it had felt like 2 years. The human ship had not moved from its position since the first contact. It had not powered weapons. It had not sent threats. It simply waited, patient as stone, while the entire Concord scrambled behind the scenes to decide what to do. Grand Marshal Dorun Kesh stepped off the shuttle onto Velkar Reach, with a small honor guard and a team of translators, historians, and one very nervous young diplomat named Farron Okasa, who had been chosen for this mission mostly because he had written his doctoral thesis on the Ash War, and was considered, within the Concord's small academic circles, the closest thing they had to a human expert, despite having never actually met one. "Commander Rolt," Dorun said, greeting Issa on the docking platform. "Status." "No change, sir. The ship remains in position. Captain Voss has requested to speak with someone who can actually decide something. His words, not mine." Dorun's mouth twitched in something that might have been the ghost of a smile, though his eyes remained serious. "Then let's not keep him waiting any longer than we already have." They set up the meeting in the station's largest conference room, though largest, on a border post like Velkar Reach, still meant a room barely big enough for 12 people and a table. The humans, it turned out, did not want to meet in person, not yet. Captain Voss explained, through the comm channel, that trust needed to be built slowly, and that a face-to-face meeting could come later, once both sides had spoken enough to feel steady about it. Dorun accepted this without argument. He understood, better than most, why humans might be cautious about walking into a room full of the same species that had once sent 70 warships into their home without warning. The channel opened, and the calm, tired voice of Captain Elias Voss filled the small room. "Grand Marshal Kesh," Voss said, "thank you for coming yourself. I know that wasn't a small thing to ask." "Captain Voss," Dorun replied, "you said something is coming, something bigger than the border between us. I would like you to explain, in full, what you mean." There was a pause on the other end, long enough that Farron Okasa, sitting nervously at the edge of the table, began to fidget with the edge of his notes. "I'm going to tell you some history first," Voss said finally. "Not the history you already know about the Ash War. Something older, something that happened before we ever met your people, before we even left Earth for good. I think you need to understand it, or nothing else I say will make sense." "We're listening," Dorfrun said. Voss began to speak, and as he did, the recording that would later be studied by historians across 12 Concord worlds captured every word. "A long time ago," Voss said, "humanity almost destroyed itself. Not through war with an alien species. We hadn't even met one yet, not for certain. We destroyed ourselves through our own conflicts. Nations against nations, ideas against ideas, greed against everything. Our homeworld, Earth, became a place of ruined cities and poisoned skies. Billions of people died over the course of just a few generations, not from any single war, but from a long, grinding collapse that no one seemed able to stop." He paused, and Dorun noticed, even through the flat tone of the translated audio, something heavy in the silence that followed. By the time we understood what we were doing to ourselves, it was almost too late. A small number of us, scientists, engineers, ordinary people who refused to give up, built the first-generation ships and launched them out into the dark, hoping to save something of what we were, even if Earth itself couldn't be saved. We didn't know if we'd survive the journey. Most of the people who left Earth never saw a new home. Their children did, or their children's children. "This is recorded in your treaty history," Farron said quietly, glancing at Dorun for permission to speak. Dorun nodded, and Farron continued. "We knew Earth had been abandoned. We assumed it was destroyed by war. It wasn't destroyed," Voss said. "It was just empty, worn out. We left it standing, like a grave marker, because none of us could bear to erase it completely. The signals your first scouts picked up, all those old broadcasts, those were echoes. Recordings still bouncing around, playing to no one, for centuries after everyone had already gone." Dorun thought of the reports from 50 years ago, of Vashtu Delaunay's fleet finding empty cities and endless broadcast loops, and finally understood the tragedy of it in a way the old records had never quite conveyed. The Concord scouts had not found a graveyard of violence. They had found a memorial, undisturbed, and mistaken it for an opportunity. "So when our fleet arrived," Dorun said slowly, "they weren't finding a dead world ready to be claimed. They were walking into a grave," Voss finished for him. "Yes, and not just any grave. The grave of everything we almost lost completely. The place we swore we would return to and rebuild one day, once we were strong enough and ready enough. When your first scout ships got there and started scanning it like a piece of real estate, and then a whole fleet followed behind them, ready to claim it, that wasn't just a border violation to us. That felt like grave robbery. That felt like someone walking into a cemetery with construction equipment." The room was silent for a long moment. Farron Okasa, who had spent years studying the Ash War from a purely tactical and political angle, felt something shift in his chest, a piece of understanding sliding into place that no textbook had ever given him. "We reacted the way we did," Voss continued, "because for us, that empty world wasn't just territory. It was the one thing we all agreed, across every human colony, no matter how different we'd become from each other over the generations. It was the one thing we agreed we would protect, no matter what. When your fleet showed up armed and ready to claim it without asking, without even trying to talk first, it confirmed every fear we had about what might be waiting for us out in the wider galaxy. We fought like we did, because we believed, in that moment, that we were fighting for our right to exist at all." Dorun leaned back slowly in his chair. Around the table, the historians and translators exchanged glances, none of them quite sure what to say. It was Dorun who finally broke the silence. "I want you to know," he said, choosing his words with obvious care, "that the Concord Council of that time made a grave error, not just in strategy, but in judgment. We should have approached your people with patience and respect from the very first contact, not with a show of force disguised as diplomacy. I cannot undo what was done 50 years ago, but I can tell you that the Council today understands the mistake and regrets it." There was a pause, and then Voss's voice came through again, softer now, less guarded. "That means something. I'll pass it along to the people who need to hear it. But Grand Marshal, I didn't come here to relitigate old history. I came here because of what's happening now, and I need you to understand the old history first, so you'll believe me when I tell you what we've found." "Then tell us," Dorun said. Voss was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice had changed, less like a soldier delivering a report, more like a man carrying a weight he badly wanted to set down. "About 6 months ago," he said, "one of our deep space listening arrays, far out past our own border, picked up something strange. Not a signal exactly, more like the absence of signals. An entire cluster of systems, nearly 40 light-years across, just went quiet. No more broadcasts, no more drive signatures, no more anything. We'd been tracking activity out there for years, minor species, nothing we'd made contact with, nothing your Concord had claimed either, as far as we knew. Small, scattered colonies, going about their business. And they all stopped," Dorun said. "All at once. Over the course of about 3 weeks, every single signal from that region went dark. We sent a scout ship to investigate, quietly, carefully, staying well outside any territory that might provoke a response. What they found, Voss trailed off, and for a moment there was only static on the line, as if he were gathering himself. What they found was ash, Grand Marshal. Not metaphorical ash, real ash. Planets scorched down to bare rock. Fleets reduced to drifting debris fields, so thoroughly destroyed that our sensors couldn't even identify what weapons had been used. No survivors. No wreckage large enough to salvage. Just gone. Farron Okasa felt a chill run down his spine. He glanced at Dorvoon, whose 4 eyes had gone very still. We don't know what did it, Voss continued. Our best scientists have studied the sensor data for months, and all they can agree on is that whatever caused this destruction was not a natural disaster, and it was not a war between two roughly equal sides. It was closer to an extermination. Something came through that region and erased every trace of civilized life, methodically, planet by planet, system by system. And Grand Marshal, that region is not that far from either your border or ours. If this thing, whatever it is, continues expanding at the rate our scans suggest, it will reach human space within 2 years. It will reach Concord space not long after that. Dorvoon's voice, when he finally spoke, was carefully controlled, but Issa, still standing near the door, could hear the effort it took to keep it that way. Do you have any information at all about what this threat actually is? Fragments, Voss admitted. Our scout ship recovered a partial data core from one of the destroyed colonies before it had to retreat. It was badly damaged, and most of what we've been able to recover is corrupted. But there's enough to tell us a few things. Whatever attacked that region was not interested in conquest. They didn't take slaves. They didn't take resources in any way our economists could identify. They didn't even seem interested in occupying the territory afterward. They came, they destroyed everything that showed signs of technology or organized life, and then they left. Like they were clearing something out. Like the people living there were an infestation to be removed, rather than an enemy to be defeated. The room had gone completely silent. Even Farron, who had spent his entire career studying the horrors of the Ash War, felt a new kind of cold settle into his bones at the calm, matter-of-fact way Voss described what his people had found. We don't know how many of them there are, Voss said. We don't know where they came from, or why they started clearing that region, or what triggers their attacks. What we do know is that they're coming this way, slowly but steadily, and that whatever this threat is, it is far beyond anything either of our peoples has faced before, including, Grand Marshal, whatever the two of us fought 50 years ago. Dorvoon sat with that for a long moment, his mind working through the implications. And you came to warn us, he said finally, even though we are, by treaty, still technically strangers, separated by a line neither of us was supposed to cross. We came to warn you, Voss confirmed, because the alternative is that this thing reaches your space unprepared, tears through the Concord the way it tore through that cluster, and then reaches us anyway. Except now, we'd be facing it alone, with the Concord already gone, and unable to help. That's not a future any of us wants. My government debated for weeks about whether to send a ship across the border at all, given everything that happened last time. In the end, they decided that the risk of staying silent was worse than the risk of reopening old wounds. I am grateful for that decision, Dorvoon said quietly, more grateful than I can easily express. Don't thank us yet, Voss said, and there was a grim edge to his voice now. I haven't told you the worst part. Dorvoon's eyes narrowed slightly. Go on! The data core we recovered, the damaged one from the destroyed colony, it wasn't just sensor logs and technical readings, there was a message embedded in it, not from the colony that was destroyed, from whatever destroyed it. A broadcast, sent on every frequency, right before the final attack on each system. Our translators have spent months working on it, cross-referencing it against every known language pattern we have, including some of your Concord's own archived transmissions that we intercepted over the years. And, Dorvoon pressed, when Voss paused again. We think we've translated part of it, Voss said. It's short. It's not exactly a threat. Not in the way your council announcement 50 years ago was a threat, or the way our own warning to your fleet was a threat. It's more like a judgment being read out. As close as we can translate it, the message says something like, you have grown loud, you have grown numerous, You have forgotten the silence that keeps you safe. The cycle turns again. And then, right before each attack, the same final line, repeated across every single system that was destroyed, return to silence. No one in the small conference room spoke for a long moment. Outside the viewport, the massive shape of the Ember's Rest continued to sit motionless in the dark, a silent sentinel bearing news that no one present had wanted to hear. Issa Rolt, standing quietly by the door, found herself thinking of the soft, gentle alarm that had first announced the human ship's arrival, an alarm designed not to frighten, but simply to inform, calmly, of a danger approaching. She thought that whatever species had sent that message across a dying colony must have wanted something similar, not to terrify their victims in the final moment, but simply to explain, calmly and without anger, exactly why they were about to die. Somehow, that calmness frightened her, far more than rage would have. "Captain Voss," Dorun said finally, his voice steady despite everything. "What does your government propose we do?" "Talk," Voss said simply. "Really talk, this time, not through 50 years of silence and old fear, but honestly, the way we should have from the very beginning. We need to share what we know. We need to figure out, together, whether there's any way to prepare for this, or slow it down, or possibly even stop it before it reaches either of our peoples. And Grand Marshal, I won't pretend this is going to be easy. There are people on my side who still don't trust the Concord, who remember the Ash War as clearly as you do, and who think this whole mission is a mistake. I imagine you have people on your side who feel the same way about trusting us." "You imagine correctly," Dorun said, with the faintest trace of dark humor. "Then we're going to have to work through that," Voss said, "because the alternative is that this new threat finds us both too divided, too suspicious of each other, to mount any kind of real defense. And then it doesn't matter who was right about who. 50 years ago, we'll both just be more ash." Dorun looked around the small room, at Farron Okasa's pale, thoughtful face, at Issa Rolt standing steady by the door despite the fear he could see in the careful way she held herself, at the translators and historians who had come expecting to document a historic first conversation with humanity, and had instead found themselves present at the first mention of a threat that might end everything they knew. "Captain Voss," he said, "I would like to propose that you come aboard this station, in person, so that we can begin planning properly. I understand the risk this represents for your people, given our history. I am willing to guarantee your safety personally, and to meet whatever conditions your side requires to make this feel less like a trap and more like what it actually is, the beginning, I hope, of something better between us." There was a long pause on the line. When Voss spoke again, his voice carried something that might have been the smallest note of relief, buried under all the weariness and worry. "I'll need to speak with my crew," he said, "and I'll need you to understand that if anything goes wrong during this meeting, my ship has orders to leave immediately, and warn every human colony within reach that the Concord cannot be trusted, treaty or no treaty. I'm not saying that as a threat, Grand Marshal. I'm saying it because I think you'd do the same, in my position." "I would," Dorun admitted, "and I accept your terms." "Then give me an hour," Voss said. "I'll come aboard. And Grand Marshal, thank you for listening. That's more than a lot of my people expected the Concord to do." The channel closed, and for a moment, no one in the small conference room moved or spoke. Then Dorun stood slowly, straightening his uniform, his 4 eyes moving across the faces of everyone present. "Prepare the station," he said. "Full honors for our guest, but no visible weapons, no armed escort beyond what is strictly necessary for security. I want this meeting to feel like what it is, an old mistake, finally being corrected, in the shadow of a much larger danger." As the room emptied and preparations began, Issa Rolt lingered by the viewport, looking out at the enormous shape of the Ember's Rest, still patient, still waiting in the dark. She thought about the ashes of the Ash War, about the empty cluster of systems Voss had described, about the calm, terrible message broadcast to dying colonies, return to silence. She did not know, yet, what shape this new threat would take, or whether the fragile alliance now being built between 2 old enemies would be enough to survive it. But she understood, standing there in the quiet hum of the station, that everything about the galaxy she had known was about to change, and that the ashes of the past might be only a small preview of the ashes still to come, unless something was done, and done quickly, by people who had once tried very hard to destroy each other, and would now have to learn, in a hurry, how to stand together instead. Somewhere out in the dark, beyond even the edge of the destroyed cluster, something vast and patient was moving closer, unhurried, certain of its purpose, carrying a message that had already been delivered to 100 worlds that no longer existed to remember hearing it. The cycle turns again. Return to silence. Brace yourself. A human warship is incoming. They entered human space. Only ashes remained. Part 3. Captain Elias Voss stepped off the shuttle onto Velkar Reach exactly 1 hour after he said he would. Not a minute early, not a minute late. Issa Rolt, standing at the head of the small honor guard Dorun had arranged, found that small detail strangely reassuring. A species that kept its word about something as simple as arrival time, she thought, might also keep its word about larger things. Voss was not what she expected. She had built a picture in her mind from the old Ash War records. Something fierce, something intimidating, a warrior shaped by 5 decades of quiet, grim readiness. Instead, the man who walked down the ramp was of medium height, with short gray hair and lines on his face that spoke of long years and harder decisions, but nothing about him radiated aggression. He moved carefully, almost gently, the way a person moves when they are deliberately trying not to seem threatening. Behind him came 2 other humans, a younger woman with dark hair pulled back tightly, introduced as Lieutenant Mara Chen, and an older man with a thick beard, introduced simply as Dr. Aldrich Simmons, a scientist. All 3 wore simple gray uniforms, unarmed, exactly as promised. Grand Marshal Kesh, Voss said, extending a hand. A gesture Farron Okasa quickly explained to Dorun was a traditional human greeting, meant to show that the hand held no weapon. Dorun copied the gesture as best he could with his long Draveth fingers, and the 2 of them shook hands under the watchful eyes of a dozen nervous officers and scientists. Captain Voss, Dorun said, welcome to Velkar Reach. I hope, in time, this can be remembered as the place where things began to change for the better. So do I, Voss said quietly. They moved to the conference room, and this time, the mood was different from the tense, careful distance of the first conversation over the comm channel. There was still caution in the room. Everyone present understood the weight of history sitting invisibly at the table with them, but there was also, for the first time, something like the beginning of trust. Before we go further, Dorun said, once everyone was seated, I want to formally apologize, on behalf of the Concord, for what happened 50 years ago, not as a political gesture, as Grand Marshal, and as someone who has read every record of that war, more times than I can count. I believe the fault was entirely ours. We treated your world as an opportunity rather than a home, and we paid, and you paid, a terrible price for that mistake. Voss studied him for a long moment before answering. I appreciate that, Grand Marshal. I mean that. But I should tell you, I wasn't alive for the Ash War. Neither was Lieutenant Chen, or Dr. Simmons here. We're 2 generations removed from it. Most of humanity today has only read about it in history texts, the same way you have. We don't carry the same raw anger our grandparents' generation did. What we carry is caution, a promise, passed down, that we won't let something like that happen again, not to us, and honestly, not to anyone else either, if we can help it. That is a more generous position than I expected, Dorun admitted. Don't mistake generosity for softness, Voss said, not unkindly. We're still cautious. We still have people back home who think this meeting is a mistake, but caution and hatred aren't the same thing, and I'd rather build something new than keep guarding an old wound forever. Dorun nodded slowly. Then let us build something new. Tell me what you need from us, and let us tell you what we can offer. Dr. Aldrich Simmons leaned forward, and for the first time since arriving, he spoke, his voice careful and precise in the way of someone used to explaining complicated things to people who might not have his background. Grand Marshal, I've spent the last several months analyzing the data we recovered from the destroyed cluster. I want to share what we know, and more importantly, what we don't know, because I think honesty about the gaps is just as important as the facts we do have. Please, Dorun said. Simmons pulled up a display, and the small holographic table at the center of the room flickered to life, showing a star map with a large region marked in dull red. The destroyed cluster Voss had described earlier. This region held at least 14 inhabited systems before the attack, Simmons said. Most were small colonies, populations in the low millions. A few were larger. One system, which our scouts called Haven Cluster 7, based on old survey data, had an estimated population of nearly 30 million before it went silent. He tapped the display, and the star map zoomed in on a single point of red light. Our scout ship recovered enough data to reconstruct part of what happened there. The attack began with what our sensors interpreted as a communication blackout. Every satellite, every relay station, simply stopped transmitting within the same 12-hour window. Then, roughly 2 days later, orbital defense platforms began failing, one after another, in a pattern too precise to be coincidence, but with no detected weapons fire, no visible enemy fleet. No weapons fire? Farron Okasa asked, unable to stop himself. None that we could identify, Simmons said. Whatever they used didn't register on any sensor calibrated for the kinds of weapons either the Concord or humanity uses. Kinetic, energy-based, even the more exotic gravitic weapons we've theorized about. None of it matches. The defense platforms simply stopped functioning, as if something reached in and turned them off from the inside. Issa felt a chill at that. A weapon that could disable defenses without firing a shot was terrifying in a way she had never had to consider before. 3 days after that, Simmons continued, the ground-based signals began to fail as well. Cities went dark, one after another, again in a pattern too orderly to be random destruction. And then, roughly a week after the first blackout began, our long-range telescopes recorded thermal spikes consistent with large-scale surface fires across the primary continent of the main colony world. After that, nothing. Total silence. You said there was no visible enemy fleet, Dorun said slowly. How does an attacking force destroy 14 systems without ships? That's the question that's kept me up more nights than I'd like to admit, Simmons said. We did detect something, right at the very edge of our scout ship's sensor range, before they had to retreat. Not a fleet in the traditional sense, more like a formation. Objects, dozens of them, moving in perfect synchronization, far larger than any ship either of our peoples build. Our best estimate puts them at roughly the size of a small moon, each one. They didn't move like ships either. No visible drive plumes, no exhaust, nothing that matched any propulsion system we've ever recorded. The room had gone very quiet. Dorun's 4 eyes had narrowed, and Issa could see the muscles in his jaw working as he processed the information. You believe these objects are responsible for the destruction, Dorun said. I believe it's the most likely explanation, Simmons said carefully. But I want to stress, Grand Marshal, that we don't actually know what they are. We don't know if they're ships or weapons platforms or something else entirely that doesn't fit neatly into either category. What we do know is that they were present in the system in the days leading up to the final destruction, and that they were gone by the time the fires started. And the message, Dorun said, the one Captain Voss mentioned, returned to silence. Simmons nodded grimly. That's the part that troubles me most, honestly. A weapon is frightening, but a weapon with intent, with something like a philosophy behind its use, that's a different kind of threat entirely. Based on the translated fragments, whatever is doing this doesn't seem to be motivated by conquest, or resources, or even hatred, as far as we can tell. The message suggests something closer to maintenance, like a gardener pruning something that's grown too large. Maintenance, Dorun repeated softly, testing the word. That's our best guess, Simmons said. And if that's accurate, it's genuinely one of the more frightening possibilities we've considered. An enemy that hates you can sometimes be reasoned with, or at least understood. An enemy that's simply tidying up, following some ancient program or purpose that has nothing to do with anger or greed. That kind of enemy doesn't negotiate, because from its perspective, there's nothing to negotiate about. You're not an opponent. You're a problem to be solved. The room sat with that thought for a long moment. Finally, it was Yissa who spoke, surprising even herself. If they're clearing out civilizations that have grown too large, or too loud, as the message says, does that mean smaller, quieter species are safe? Could we survive this by simply going dark? Reducing our signals, our expansion? Voss looked at her, and something in his expression softened slightly, as if he respected the question even though he didn't like the answer. We considered that, he said. It's part of why my government debated so long before sending me here. There's an argument that says the safest thing humanity could do is retreat, go quiet, stop expanding, and hope whatever this is passes us by. But Dr. Simmons can explain why we don't think that's a real option. Simmons nodded. The rate of expansion we've tracked doesn't match a force that's simply removing loud, expanding civilizations and leaving the quiet ones alone. Haven Cluster 7 was one of the largest, loudest systems in that region. Yes. But at least 3 of the smaller colonies destroyed alongside it had populations under 2 million, minimal industrial output, and communication patterns that would have been, by any reasonable measure, quiet. If this were purely about noise or size, those small colonies should have been the safest, not equally doomed. So going quiet wouldn't save us, Dorun said. We don't believe so, Simmons confirmed. Our working theory is that the message about silence might be less literal than it sounds, a kind of philosophical justification, rather than an actual set of rules this force follows. Or it's possible the criteria we haven't identified yet has nothing to do with noise levels at all, and the message is simply meant to explain the attack in terms the dying colonies might understand, even if the real reasoning is something else entirely. Dorun sat back, his long fingers steepled in front of him, and for a long moment the room was silent except for the faint hum of the station's systems. Then, we are facing an enemy, he said slowly, whose motives we do not understand, whose weapons we cannot identify, and whose approach we cannot predict well enough to know if hiding would even help us. Captain Voss, I must ask you directly, why come to us at all, if the situation is this uncertain? What do you believe the Concord and humanity together can actually do about a threat like this? Voss leaned forward, his hands folded on the table, and when he spoke, there was a quiet intensity in his voice that had not been there before. Honestly, Grand Marshal, I don't know if we can stop it. Maybe nothing can. But I know this. Humanity facing this alone, with our current fleet strength and our current knowledge, stands almost no chance. 14 systems, gone in weeks, and not one of them managed to even scratch whatever attacked them. That should terrify all of us equally, because if the Concord faces the same thing alone, I don't believe your outcome would be any different. You believe combining our forces gives us a better chance, Dorun said. I believe combining our forces gives us any chance at all, Voss said. Your Concord has resources, numbers, and technology we don't have. We have data, tactics, and hard lessons learned from fighting an enemy that didn't fight the way anyone expected. Lessons that might, possibly, translate to fighting something else that doesn't play by familiar rules either. Alone, we're both guessing in the dark. Together, at least we're guessing with more information. Dorun was quiet for a long moment, his eyes moving slowly around the table, taking in the faces of his own people and the 3 humans who had crossed a 50-year silence to bring this warning. I cannot make this decision alone, he said finally. The full council must be informed, and they will need to see everything you've shown us today. But I will tell you my personal recommendation, Captain Voss, and I will fight for it with everything I have. I believe we must work together, not as a formality, not as a political gesture, but genuinely, with full honesty between us, the way we should have, from the very first day your world was first surveyed by our scouts. Voss studied him for a long moment, and then nodded slowly. That's all I came here hoping to hear, Grand Marshal. I won't pretend the road ahead is going to be easy. There will be people on both sides who don't trust this alliance, who think it's a trick or a weakness or a mistake. But I'd rather face that difficulty than face what's coming out there completely alone. Later that evening, after the formal meeting had ended, and the humans had returned to their ship to rest before the next round of discussions, Issa found herself walking the quiet corridors of Velkar Reach with Farron Okasa, both of them too unsettled by the day's revelations to sleep. 14 systems, Farron said quietly, staring out a viewport at the distant, patient shape of the Ember's Rest. 30 million people in one colony alone, gone, in less than 2 weeks, and nobody even fired a shot that anyone could detect. I keep thinking about the message, Yissa admitted. Return to silence. as if the whole galaxy is too loud, and something out there has decided it's time to turn the volume down. Farron was quiet for a moment, his young face troubled in the dim corridor light. Do you think we can stop it? Whatever it is? Issa thought about the enormous, patient shape of the human warship, about Captain Voss's calm, tired voice describing horrors that would have driven a lesser commander to panic, about Dr. Simmons carefully laying out everything they didn't know with the same precision he used for what they did know. I don't know, she said honestly, but I think, for the first time since I joined this station, that we actually have a chance to try. And a few days ago, before that ship crossed our border, I don't think we had that at all. We just had fear, and an old story about ashes, and a line on a map we were all too afraid to cross. Far above them, in the dark quiet of space, the Ember's Rest continued its silent vigil beside the Concorde station, no longer an intruder, but something closer to a partner, two old enemies, bound now by a threat neither of them fully understood, beginning the long, uncertain work of learning to trust each other before it was too late. And somewhere out beyond the edge of even the destroyed cluster, in the deep dark between the stars, the vast, silent shapes that Dr. Simmons had glimpsed on his scout ship's sensors continued their slow, patient advance, unhurried, certain, following whatever ancient purpose drove them, indifferent to the small, frightened alliance now forming in their path. The cycle, it seemed, was not finished turning yet, and whether humanity and the Concorde together could find a way to stop it before it reached them both was a question that no one in that small conference room on Velkar Reach could yet answer. But for the first time in 50 years, they had at least agreed to try to answer it together. Brace yourself. A human warship is incoming. They entered human space. Only ashes remained. Part 4. 3 months after Captain Voss first crossed the border into Concorde space, the joint task force that would come to be known as the Vigil Alliance held its first full council meeting, not on Velkar Reach, and not on any human colony, but at a newly built neutral station constructed exactly on the old border line, in the empty space between the two territories. The station was small, hastily built and unglamorous, but both sides had agreed that its location mattered more than its size. It was called, by mutual agreement, Threshold. Grand Marshal Dorun Kesh stood at the head of the long table in Threshold's central chamber, looking out at a room that would have been unthinkable a year before. Concorde officers in their deep blue uniforms sat across from human officers in simple gray, and between them, translators worked quietly to smooth over the gaps that still remained in language and custom. It was not a comfortable room. There was still tension in the air, still old suspicion lingering in glances exchanged between veterans who remembered, or had been raised on stories of, the Ash War. But it was a room where both sides were, for the first time in 50 years, working toward the same goal. Let's begin, Dorun said, and the room quieted. Dr. Aldrich Simmons stood, along with a Concorde scientist named Vel Taro, a Vren with pale green skin and calm, thoughtful eyes, who had spent the last 3 months working alongside the human science teams to analyze every scrap of data recovered from the destroyed cluster. We have some progress to report, Simmons began, and some new concerns to raise. The holographic display at the center of the table flickered to life, showing an updated star map. The dull red region marking the destroyed cluster had grown noticeably larger since the last briefing, spreading outward like a stain. In the 3 months since Captain Voss first made contact, Simmons said, the destroyed region has expanded to encompass 6 additional systems. All 6 show the same pattern we identified before: communication blackout, followed by defense failures, followed by total destruction within roughly 2 weeks. At this rate of expansion, Vel Taro added, his voice calm despite the grim nature of what he was describing, our projections indicate the threat will reach the outer edge of combined human and Concorde space within approximately 14 months, significantly sooner than our original 2-year estimate. A murmur ran through the room. Dorun raised a hand for quiet. Why the accelerated timeline? He asked. 2 possibilities, Simmons said. Either the threat's rate of advance naturally increases as it consumes more territory, gaining resources or momentum we don't fully understand, or it has detected our scouting activity and is deliberately accelerating in response. You believe it may be aware of us, Dorun said. We can't rule it out, Simmons admitted. One of our automated probes, sent to observe the newest destroyed system from a safe distance, went silent 2 days after establishing observation position. We don't know if it was destroyed, or simply detected and disabled. Either way, it's the first direct evidence we have that this threat may be capable of identifying and responding to outside observation. The room absorbed this in uneasy silence. Dorun exchanged a glance with Voss, who sat near the head of the table on the human delegation's side, his expression carefully controlled but grim. Then we no longer have the luxury of slow, careful study, Dorun said. We need a plan, and we need it soon. Captain Voss, your government has had 3 months to consider our proposal for a joint defense fleet. What is humanity's answer? Voss stood, and the room's attention shifted fully to him. He was quieter than most Concord military leaders Dorun had known, but there was a steadiness in him that commanded attention regardless. Humanity's answer is yes, Voss said simply, and a ripple of reaction moved through both sides of the room, relief on some faces, lingering wariness on others. We will commit a significant portion of our fleet to a joint defense effort, under a shared command structure that we'll need to work out carefully, together. This wasn't an easy decision for my government. There are still people back home who argue this is exactly the kind of entanglement we swore off after the Ash War. But the alternative, facing this threat divided, each of us weaker for having refused to work together, is a risk none of us can afford to take. Thank you, Captain, Dorun said, and there was real gratitude in his voice. The Concord Council has authorized a similar commitment on our side. Between our 2 fleets, we will have a combined force larger than anything either of our peoples has assembled since the Ash War itself. A larger force doesn't guarantee victory, Voss said carefully, especially against an enemy we still don't fully understand. But it gives us options we wouldn't have had alone. The meeting continued for hours, moving through logistics, command structure, and the difficult, delicate work of merging 2 very different military cultures into something that could function as a single force. Concord tactics favored large, coordinated formations, heavy on numbers and firepower, built around the assumption of facing predictable, conventional opponents. Human tactics, forged in the crucible of the Ash War and refined over 50 years of cautious, isolated development, favored smaller, more flexible units, capable of rapid, unpredictable maneuvers. Our doctrine works because we've always assumed we'd be facing a larger, more conventional force, Voss explained, standing before the room's tactical display. We're used to fighting outnumbered. Your doctrine works because you've always had the numbers advantage and could afford to fight in a more direct, organized way. Against this new threat, I think we need to combine both approaches. Use the Concord's numbers to hold a stable front, while human ships handle flanking, disruption, and rapid response. Veltero studied the tactical display thoughtfully. It is an elegant theory, but we know almost nothing about how this enemy actually fights. We do not know if it has a front to hold or flanks to exploit. We are designing tactics against an opponent we have never directly engaged. That's true, Voss admitted. And it's the biggest risk in all of this. Everything we're planning is based on second-hand data and educated guesses. We won't really know how effective any of it is until we're actually facing them. Then perhaps, Dorun said slowly, we need more than second-hand data. Perhaps we need direct observation, conducted carefully, by a force capable of retreating quickly if things go wrong. The room went quiet, understanding immediately what he was suggesting. A reconnaissance mission, Voss said, into the destroyed cluster itself. Yes, Dorun said, not to engage, simply to observe, up close, with better sensors than a single automated probe, and to retreat the moment there's any sign of detection or danger. We need to see this enemy with our own eyes, or as close to it as we can safely manage, before we commit our combined fleet to a battle plan built entirely on guesswork. There was a long silence in the room as both sides considered the risk. Finally, it was Mara Chen, the young human lieutenant who had accompanied Voss to Velkar Reach months before and had since become one of the most respected junior officers in the Joint Task Force, who spoke up. I'll volunteer to lead it, she said. I've spent the last 3 months studying every scrap of data we have on this threat. I know the risk profile better than almost anyone else here. Voss looked at her for a long moment, clearly torn between pride and concern. Mara. "Captain, someone has to do it," she said, her voice steady. "It might as well be someone who's studied this as closely as I have." Dorun looked to Veltero. "The Concord will provide an escort ship and a science team to accompany the mission, if Lieutenant Chen is willing to work jointly." "I'd prefer it that way," Chen said. "This needs to be a joint mission from the start, not just a human operation the Concord tags along on." And so it was decided. Within 2 weeks, a small joint task force, 1 human scout ship, the Quiet Step, and 1 Concord escort vessel, the Watchful Eye, crewed by a combined team of human and Concord officers working together for the first time in any real operational capacity, would depart from Threshold and make their way toward the edge of the destroyed cluster, carrying with them the hopes and the fears of 2 civilizations that had spent 50 years too afraid of each other to imagine they might one day need to trust one another this completely. The journey to the edge of the destroyed cluster took nearly 3 weeks. Aboard the Quiet Step, Mara Chen spent much of that time in quiet conversation with her Concord counterpart, a young officer named Dessa Varen, a Koran with sharp eyes and a dry sense of humor that had, slowly, begun to put the mixed crew at ease with each other. "You're not what I expected," Dessa admitted one evening, as the 2 of them reviewed sensor calibration data together in the ship's small observation lounge. "Growing up, humans were always described like monsters almost. Something in the stories that ate whole fleets and asked no questions." Mara smiled faintly. "We grew up with a version of your people too. Cold, calculating. The ones who came to steal our home and didn't even have the decency to ask first." "Fair," Dessa said. "I suppose we were both telling ourselves stories that made the other side easier to hate. Easier than admitting the truth was just a terrible mistake, made by people too proud or too afraid to slow down and actually talk. Maybe that's the real lesson in all of this," Mara said, looking out at the passing stars. "Whatever's out there, killing whole systems without a word of explanation beyond a warning nobody understood in time. Maybe the only real defense against something like that is making sure people like us don't repeat it on a smaller scale, against each other." Dessa was quiet for a moment, considering that. "That's either very wise or very naive. I haven't decided which." Mara laughed softly. "Ask me again, after we've actually seen this thing. Maybe I'll have a better answer." They reached the observation point at the very edge of the destroyed cluster on the 22nd day of the journey. The Quiet Step and the Watchful Eye held position at extreme sensor range, far enough, they hoped, to avoid detection, close enough to finally get a clear look at whatever had erased 14, now 20, systems from existence. For the first 6 hours, there was nothing but the eerie, empty quiet of dead space. Sensor readings showed the burned husks of what had once been thriving worlds, orbital debris fields where cities and stations had once stood, and an unsettling silence across every frequency that should have carried at least some background noise from a living system. Then, on the 7th hour, Dessa's sensor station lit up with an alert. "Contact," she said, her voice tight. "Multiple contacts. Bearing." She checked the readout twice, as if not quite believing it. "They're moving toward the system directly ahead of us. The one your listening post flagged as still active 3 days ago." Mara moved quickly to the main viewport, watching as the ship's long-range optical sensors resolved the distant shapes into something visible. What she saw took her breath away. They were exactly as Simmons had described from the earlier, more limited data. Vast, moon-sized objects, dozens of them, moving in perfect, silent formation. But seeing them with her own eyes, even from this great distance, gave Mara a visceral understanding that no report could have conveyed. They did not move like ships. They moved like something alive, drifting with an unhurried, deliberate grace that felt far more unsettling than any aggressive maneuver could have. Getting a full sensor sweep, Dessa reported, her hands moving carefully over her console, careful not to trigger anything that might reveal their position. "Mara, I'm picking up energy readings I don't recognize. Not weapon signatures, not drive signatures, something else." "Show me," Mara said, and the data scrolled across the shared display between them. Strange, rhythmic pulses of energy, almost like a heartbeat, radiating from the formation of enormous shapes as they drew closer to the still-living system ahead. "It's building toward something," Dessa said quietly. "Whatever they do to trigger the blackout, I think we're about to see it happen in real time. They watched, helpless and silent, as the massive shapes drew closer to the unsuspecting system ahead. A system, they knew from the listening post data, that still held an active colony, still had people going about their lives, unaware that the vast, silent formation was already bearing down upon them. "Should we warn them?" Mara asked, her voice tight with the horror of what she was watching. "We don't have a way to reach them without revealing our position," Dessa said, her voice equally strained. "And if we do reveal ourselves, we risk drawing their attention directly to us, with 2 ships and 40 crew members. Against that." Mara stared at the screen, at the small, distant point of light that represented a living world about to fall silent forever, and felt a helplessness she had never experienced in her entire career. "We have to record everything," she said finally, her voice barely steady. "Every reading, every pattern, every scrap of data we can gather. If we can't save them, the least we can do is make sure their deaths aren't wasted. We bring this back, and we make sure it helps us stop this from happening to anyone else." Dessa nodded grimly, and together, the small joint crew of the Quiet Step and the Watchful Eye began recording, in careful, horrified silence, as the massive shapes reached the edge of the living system ahead of them, and the first communication blackouts began exactly as the earlier data had predicted. They stayed at their observation post for 6 more days, gathering every scrap of data they could, watching in helpless silence as an entire system's worth of life, slowly, methodically, went dark, until finally, with heavy hearts and a wealth of new, terrible information, they turned their ships back toward Threshold, carrying with them proof of a threat more vast and more patient than either humanity or the Concord had truly understood, and the grim knowledge that the timeline for facing it, together, was shorter than anyone had hoped. "Brace yourself. A human warship is incoming. They entered human space. Only ashes remained." Part 5. The Quiet Step and the Watchful Eye returned to Threshold 9 months after the Joint Task Force first departed, carrying data that would reshape everything the Vigil Alliance thought it understood about the threat advancing toward them. Mara Chen and Dessa Varen stood together before the full assembled council, exhausted, changed by what they had witnessed, and united in a way that no diplomatic ceremony could have manufactured. "We watched an entire system die," Mara said, her voice steady, despite the weight of the memory behind her words. "We couldn't save them, but we gathered enough data to understand, for the first time, exactly what we're facing." Dr. Simmons and Veltero had spent the following weeks poring over the recovered data, working side by side almost around the clock, and when they finally presented their findings to the full council, the room listened in tense, absolute silence. "The rhythmic energy pulses Lieutenant Chen and Officer Varen recorded," Simmons explained, "match a pattern we've now identified in the earlier destroyed systems as well, though it was too subtle for our automated probes to catch clearly before. We believe these massive objects are not weapons platforms in the traditional sense. We believe they are something closer to a coordinated biological system, enormous, ancient constructs that function together almost like cells in a single organism, each one contributing a small part of an overwhelming unified effect." "A single unified attack," Dorun said slowly. "Not individual weapons firing, but one coordinated pulse, delivered by dozens of these constructs simultaneously." "That's our working theory," Veltero confirmed, "and it explains why our sensors have struggled to identify a specific weapons signature. There isn't a weapon in the way we understand the term. There's an effect, produced collectively, that disrupts electronic systems first, and biological ones, the surface fires and the confirmed loss of all life signs, shortly after." "Can it be blocked?" "Shielded against?" Voss asked, leaning forward. "We believe so," Simmons said, and for the first time since the mission had returned, there was a note of genuine hope in his voice. "The energy signature, once you know what to look for, follows a specific frequency pattern. It's not something either of our existing shield technologies were designed to block, because neither of us had ever encountered anything like it before. But now that we understand the pattern, Veltero's team and my team have already begun designing a countermeasure." A ripple of cautious optimism moved through the room, the first the Vigil Alliance had felt since Voss's ship first crossed the border nearly a year before. "We can't promise it will work perfectly," Veltero cautioned. "We have not tested it in real combat conditions. and there may be aspects of this threat we still don't understand. But for the first time, we have something more than guesses. We have a plan. Over the following 4 months, the combined shipyards of humanity and the Concorde worked at a pace neither civilization had ever attempted before. Human engineers who had spent 50 years perfecting small, agile ship designs built for a war of quick strikes and quicker retreats worked alongside Concorde engineers, whose expertise lay in massive, coordinated fleet construction to retrofit the growing Vigil Alliance fleet with the new shielding technology. It was not always smooth work. There were arguments, misunderstandings, moments where old suspicion flared up under the pressure of impossible deadlines. A human engineer accused a Concorde counterpart of deliberately slowing progress on a shared project. The accusation turned out to be a simple translation error, but it took 3 days and a personal apology from Dorahun himself to smooth over the damage. A Concorde admiral, still privately doubtful that humanity's smaller ships could hold their own in a real fleet engagement, nearly withdrew support for an integrated command structure until Voss quietly arranged for the admiral to review, in full, the complete tactical records of the Ash War, not to intimidate, but to demonstrate, clearly and without exaggeration, exactly what human tactics were capable of when properly understood rather than feared. Slowly, painstakingly, the alliance held together, and as the months passed, something Dorun Kesh had not fully expected began to happen. The fear and suspicion that had defined the relationship between their two peoples for 50 years began, in small, quiet ways, to be replaced by something else. Not quite friendship, not yet, but respect. And in some corners of the growing joint fleet, something that looked, unmistakably, like the beginnings of trust. 14 months after Captain Voss first crossed the border, exactly as Simmons's projections had warned, the vast, silent formation reached the outer edge of the region, claimed jointly by the Vigil Alliance. The battle that followed would later be remembered, across both human and Concorde history, as the Battle of Threshold Line, though it was fought not at the small station where the Alliance had first taken shape, but at the outermost human colony system of Caro's Hope, the first inhabited world in the path of the advancing threat. Dorun Kesh commanded the combined fleet from the bridge of the Vigil of Sanok, with Voss serving as co-commander aboard the Ember's Rest, the two ships positioned side by side at the heart of a formation that neither species could have assembled alone. Concorde battle cruisers, forming a stable, coordinated front line, human strike ships arrayed in flexible, fast-moving formations along the flanks, ready to exploit whatever opportunities the battle presented. Formation holding, Voss's voice came over the shared command channel, steady, despite the enormity of what was approaching. Shields report full integration of the new countermeasure across 94% of the fleet. The remaining 6%? Dorun asked. Reserve ships, held back per the plan, Voss confirmed. If the countermeasure fails, we need something in reserve to cover a full retreat. Dorun nodded, watching the tactical display as the vast, moon-sized shapes of the enemy formation drew steadily closer, exactly as they had at every previous system, unhurried, certain, radiating the same slow, rhythmic energy pulses that Mara Chen and Dessa Varen had first recorded nearly a year before. All ships, Dorun said, his voice carrying across the combined fleet, translated instantly into both Concorde and human command languages. This is Grand Marshal Kesh. Whatever comes next, we face it together, as we have trained to for the last year. Hold formation, trust the plan, trust each other. There was a pause, and then Voss's voice came again, quieter, meant only for Dorun. For what it's worth, Grand Marshal, whatever happens today, I'm glad we didn't face this alone. And I don't think you would have wanted to face it alone either. No, Dorun said simply, I would not have. The enemy formation reached engagement range, and the rhythmic energy pulses that had preceded every previous attack began to build, radiating outward from the massive, silent shapes in a pattern the combined science teams had studied for months. Across the fleet, the new shielding countermeasure activated in response, a wave of protective energy spreading across every ship in the formation. For a long, terrible moment, nothing happened. The energy pulse struck the fleet's shields, and Dorun watched, his hearts, all four of them, in the Dravith way, pounding with a dread he had not felt since the darkest days of his early military career. Then the tactical display updated, and a ragged, exhausted cheer went up across the bridge of the Vigil of Senok. "Shields holding," the tactical officer reported, disbelief evident in her voice. 91% effectiveness across the fleet. "We have minimal system disruption on the affected 6%, but no catastrophic failures." "It's working," Voss's voice came over the channel, and for the first time in the entire year Dorun had known him, there was something like genuine, unguarded relief in his tone. "Grand Marshal, the countermeasure is working." But the battle was far from over. As the shields held against the initial pulse, the vast, silent shapes of the enemy formation began to shift, drawing closer, adjusting their approach in response to the failure of their primary effect. The first time, according to every scrap of data recovered from the destroyed cluster, that this ancient threat had ever needed to adapt its tactics. "They're changing formation," Decivaran reported from her station aboard the Watchful Eye, now serving as part of the fleet's forward sensor picket. "Grand Marshal, I think they're surprised. Whatever they are, I don't think anyone has ever stopped that first pulse before." "Then let's make sure we don't stop there," Dorun said grimly. "Voss, your flanking units, now, before they finish adjusting." "Copy that," Voss said. "All strike wings. This is Ember's Rest. Execute pattern Delta. Let's show them what 50 years of preparing for exactly this kind of moment looks like." The human strike ships surged forward along the flanks of the combined formation, moving with the fast, unpredictable grace that had once terrified an entire Concord invasion fleet, now turned in defense of both peoples together. They struck at the edges of the enemy formation, probing for weaknesses, retreating and striking again before the vast, moon-sized shapes could fully respond, while the Concord battle line held steady at the center, absorbing the brunt of the enemy's continued attempts to break through. The battle raged for 6 hours, longer than any engagement either side had fought in living memory, and grinding, terrible hours they were, filled with losses on both sides that would be mourned for generations to come. 3 Concord battle cruisers were lost in the opening hours, their aging shield systems unable to fully withstand the enemy's continued assault, even with the new countermeasure in place. 2 human strike ships were caught in a retaliatory pulse that the enemy formation, adapting with unsettling speed, managed to redirect specifically at the flanking units, causing them the most trouble. But slowly, grindingly, the combined fleet's coordinated defense began to hold, and then, as the 6th hour wore on, to turn the tide. Dr. Simmons and Veltero, monitoring the battle from Threshold alongside a rotating team of analysts, identified a secondary weakness in the enemy's adapted formation, a brief window, roughly 90 seconds long, during which the massive constructs had to synchronize their energy output before launching each new pulse, leaving them, for that short window, unable to adjust to sudden changes in the battlefield. "Grand Marshal Captain Voss," Simmons's voice broke into the command channel, urgent and fast. "We've found a pattern. Every time they prepare a new pulse, there's a synchronization window, about 90 seconds, where their formation is essentially fixed in place. If you can concentrate fire during that window, we can hit them where it counts," Voss finished, already relaying the information to his strike wing commanders. "Grand Marshal, if the Concord line can hold through one more pulse cycle, my ships can identify the synchronization window and coordinate a concentrated strike on the weakest point in their formation." "Do it," Dorun said. "All ships, hold formation. We have one chance to make this count." The next pulse came, and the combined fleet's shields held once more, weakened but still functional. And in the 90-second window that followed, as the massive enemy constructs began the slow, synchronized process of preparing their next attack, the human strike wings moved with a coordinated precision that made even the Concord officers watching from the Vigil of Senok's bridge fall silent in awe. Dozens of human ships converged on a single point in the enemy formation, concentrating every available weapon on one construct, larger than any ship either fleet possessed, and for the first time in the entire battle, something in the massive ancient formation cracked. The construct did not explode in the way a conventional ship might. Instead, it seemed almost to shudder, its rhythmic energy pulse faltering, and then, slowly, The massive shape began to drift, dark and lifeless, out of formation. A ragged cheer went up across the combined fleet's command channels, human and Concord voices mixing together in a moment of shared, desperate hope. "One down," Voss said, his voice tight with controlled emotion. "Grand Marshal, we can do this again. We need another synchronization window." It took 3 more cycles, 3 more coordinated strikes, 3 more agonizing periods of holding the line while the Concord battlecruisers absorbed pulse after pulse, their shields growing weaker with each successive attack, before the enemy formation finally began, for the first time in its recorded history of destruction, to retreat. It did not flee in panic, the way a conventional force might. It withdrew slowly, deliberately, the surviving constructs regrouping and moving away from the battle at the same unhurried pace they had used to advance, as if even in retreat, they refused to be rushed by anything so small as the fleet that had just cost them 4 of their number. But it was a retreat, unmistakably, and as the massive shapes faded from sensor range, the combined fleet of the Vigil Alliance remained, battered, exhausted, having lost ships and crew that would be mourned deeply on both sides, but victorious in a way that no one, not Dorun Kesh, not Elias Voss, not any of the exhausted officers and scientists who had worked for over a year to make this moment possible, had truly believed was achievable when the battle began. In the weeks that followed the Battle of Threshold Line, the joint fleet held a memorial ceremony at Caro's Hope, the human colony that had nearly become the newest addition to the long, terrible list of worlds erased by the ancient threat. Human and Concord officers stood together, side by side, honoring the dead of both fleets with a single, shared ceremony, the first time in the history of either civilization that such a thing had happened. Dorun Kesh stood before the assembled crowd, human and Concord alike, and delivered words that would be remembered and repeated for generations to come. 50 years ago, he said, our 2 peoples met for the first time, and that meeting ended in tragedy, built on fear and misunderstanding, and the terrible mistake of treating a stranger's home as an empty prize to be claimed. We spent 5 decades apart, separated by a line neither side dared to cross, carrying the ashes of that mistake with us, as a warning never to repeat it. He paused, looking out at the crowd, at the mixed formation of human and Concord ships, still visible in the sky above Caro's Hope, scarred but victorious. Today, we honor the dead of a different battle entirely, a battle we fought not against each other, but beside each other, against a threat that neither of us could have hoped to face alone. I do not know what challenges still lie ahead of us. I do not know if the threat we drove back today will return, stronger, or if some other danger waits in the dark beyond our combined territory. But I know this: we are stronger together than we ever were apart, and the ashes of our past do not have to define the shape of our future. Elias Voss stood beside him, and when Dorun finished speaking, it was Voss who stepped forward to address the crowd, his voice carrying clearly across the assembled mourners. My people spent 50 years believing that the safest thing we could do was stay quiet, stay separate, and trust no one beyond our own borders, he said. That belief was born from real pain, real loss, and I don't think any of us should be ashamed of the caution it gave us. But today, I stood shoulder to shoulder with people my grandparents' generation would have called enemies, and together, we saved a world that might otherwise have become nothing more than ashes, like so many worlds before it. He looked out at the crowd, human faces and Concord faces mixed together, united in grief and in hard-won hope. I think that's worth remembering, he said, not because it erases what happened 50 years ago, but because it proves that even after the worst mistakes, even after the deepest fear, it's still possible to choose something better. We chose it together, today, and I believe we can keep choosing it, for as long as it takes to make sure no other world has to learn what Caro's Hope nearly learned, that silence and separation, in the end, protect no one. As the ceremony ended and the crowd slowly dispersed, Yissa Rolt, who had traveled from Velkar Reach to attend the memorial, found herself standing beside Mara Chen, both of them looking up at the scarred but intact ships, still holding formation in the sky above. "Do you think it's really over?" Mara asked quietly. "The threat, I mean. Do you think they'll come back?" Issa considered the question for a long moment, thinking of the vast, patient shapes retreating into the dark, of the ancient, unknowable purpose that had driven them to erase 20 living systems before finally being stopped. "I don't know," she said honestly, "but I know that whatever comes next, we won't be facing it the way we were a year ago, alone, afraid, and divided by an old mistake we were too proud to admit. Whatever's still out there in the dark, at least now we'll face it together." Above them, the combined fleet of the Vigil Alliance held its position in the sky over Caro's Hope, a symbol not of the ashes that had once defined the relationship between two wary civilizations, but of the fragile, hard-won trust that had grown, against all odds, from that terrible history, a trust that would be tested again, in time, by whatever new dangers the galaxy still held in store, but which had, on this day, proven strong enough to save a world that might otherwise have joined the long, silent list of the lost. And far beyond the edge of even the retreating enemy formation, in the deep, patient dark between the stars, something ancient and vast continued to watch, recalculating, adjusting, learning for the first time in its long, silent history that the small, scattered civilizations it had always found so easy to erase might not, after all, remain so easy. Not now that two of them had finally learned to stand together instead of alone. The cycle had turned, but for the first time in longer than anyone could remember, it had not turned toward silence. It had turned toward hope.